If you are a beginner writer, you will have come across the advice that we're going to look at today. It's the kind of advice that you get at the very beginning and that will follow you all the time whenever you are looking up writing advice. Some of it I feel is very generic, very much kind of like the stuff that people tell you when they don't really know themselves what it is that they're doing. That's why we're going to rank very generic starting writing advice today in terms of how useful it is and also in terms of how damaging some of it is, I feel. Okay, so the first one that I personally hate is just write. I'm going to put it here. It has some merit in terms of, if you are scared of getting started, the best thing to do is to probably just try to do it and learn as you are doing it rather than trying to overthink it and just getting stuck in this whole overthinking paralyzation thing, right? But for me, the reason why I really hate this advice is because it's always kind of like told in this condescending way of you are just being dramatic and you are just procrastinating, you should be writing, why aren't you writing, just write. The reason why it really annoys me is because it's often told by even really famous writers. They are asked, okay, so how do you write? Or rather, me as a wannabe writer, where do I start? How do I start? And it's just kind of like, you just have to write. Yeah, I know that part, thank you. What I'm looking for is you as the person who has written a lot of stories, who has their own process. What is your process? What do you do when you sit down and just write? What do you write about? Do you start with your character? Do you start, if you have no idea, do you just make up random scenarios and just keep at the random scenarios until you basically have something, What does the process look like? That's what I feel like most of us are looking for when we're looking to people who are giving writing advice, right? And this whole thing of, have you considered actually doing it? Is like, you're giving me nothing, okay? So that's why I hate this advice. But a bit controversial, the next one I actually really love, and I know a lot of people hate it, but it's write every day. So personally, I would put it here. The reason why is that I tried it out and it really worked for me. The reason why it really works for me is that I like this consistency thing, and for me what worked is this whole thing of, okay, I know I'm not really good at this and I don't really know what I'm doing, but I'm showing up every day, doing it a bit, and that really helped me stay in my story, and it really helped me get into the flow of making this like a habit thing that I do naturally rather than like this grand occasion that I have to build myself up to. So that's why it really worked for me. And the reason why it's great starter advice, I think, is because it's really kind of like something that you can do easily. So it's like, okay, you have no idea what you're doing, just start with doing a bit of it every day for now to at least build up this sort of consistency. This is the starting point for your routine, and then as you have that part set, you can then start to basically build on it and flesh it out and cut back if every day doesn't work anymore, because it's just really about at least knowing how to build consistency, right? Read a lot is something that I actually like this one a lot too, because it's kind of like this thing of learn as much about the craft and what you like in stories as you can, right? And I don't really agree that it has to be just reading. I don't agree that if you never read but you consume a lot of stories in other ways that you can never be a good writer, because you are picking up so many story techniques and elements from other stories as well that you can integrate into your own writing, even if you yourself don't read books as such, right? So that's why I personally would never make it that narrow, but in general speaking, consume a lot of stories and learn from them, learn what you like, learn what you don't like, pick up kind of like the repeating elements that you like, and just basically insert yourself into why you fell in love with storytelling in the first place, so that you want to keep doing it yourself. So that's why I really like this advice, especially for a beginner, because again, it's something that you can easily do. It's very clear cut, and that is very beneficial in my opinion. Don't use overdone tropes is something that I personally really don't like. The reason why I don't like it is, on one side, as a reader, I am not the kind of reader who really cares that much about what is trending in the market. I like the stories that I like the tropes that I like, and if a story is done really well in a sort of fresh way, or it has fresh characters, or it's the same story but it's told really well and I like the original story, I will still read or watch this story. But as a wannabe writer, as a beginner writer, I feel this is the kind of advice that is so unnecessary as a starting point, because it's like you are just starting out trying to learn the craft, right? The skill. You're starting to tell your own story. You might be excited about a story idea that is probably based on one of those overdone trope stories that you yourself liked, right? So then hearing this kind of advice is like just going to give you doubt as to whether you should pursue this idea and just, write this story rather than going and looking for the next newer, fresher thing that would make you more original, leading you away from the reason why you want to write it in the first place. And it's such a market-based approach. I don't like it because as a beginner of a skill, you are not far along enough to wonder about how well you can sell your story if you can't even trust yourself that you're going to write the story completely, right? Or that you can't trust yourself that you're able to tell the story well because you are very much still at the beginning phase, right? That's the funny thing. Whenever I come across this advice, and obviously I really don't agree with this advice, I don't like this advice, but every time I hear this advice, there's like this moment where I wonder myself, am I using an overdone trope? Yes, I am. Am I being stupid writing this story? Nobody's going to like this story because I'm using such an overdone trope, and obviously I'm not being original and stuff like that, right? So I have this moment of doubt and kind of like liking my own story idea less because I hear this advice, even though I myself don't agree with this advice, and then go on to dismiss this advice, right? So it's really just kind of like at the beginning when you're starting to figure out so many things. The last thing you need is somebody giving you some sort of weird marketing tip that is just going to dampen your enthusiasm. Which then leads to the next advice that is also given, and that is the complete opposite, which is nothing is original. So on one hand, they tell you don't use overdone tropes, but then on the other hand, they tell you don't worry about being original because nothing is original. All the stories are told and you are never going to be original anyway, so don't bother trying, okay? So there's that. But then if we take this advice as a standalone advice, I think there's some merit to it in terms of, yes, all the stories have been told. I don't agree that there is nothing original, because the whole thing about what is considered original isn't defined, right? So we're not talking about plot types, we're talking about there are original characters that show up all the time, right? So where there are original takes on stories that have been done, right? So just original in itself isn't defined well enough to tell us that that isn't possible, right? This advice is more meant as a don't let yourself be dragged down by the idea of having to be original at the beginning phase, right? What matters more is tell your story well, and then you are going to end up being original in just doing that, right? From that perspective, good advice, kind of like it, but I'll put it here because it's kind of a solid middle ground. It's kind of like, don't worry too much about it, but I'm not giving you anything more than that, other than just telling you not to worry about it. So where are we going to put show, don't tell? Show, don't tell is something that I feel is the kind of advice that someone, somewhere, once told someone who told their story too much that they should show it more, and it's kind of got repeated and became like this archetype advice that you hear every time, that has been repeated so many times that it almost lost a bit of meaning in itself. The thing is that as soon as people start to talk about show, don't tell, it's like, yeah, but what if you have like this situation, then you have to tell the story. So both are needed, right? You want to show the story. I want to see the details of this scene and what exactly happens. That's what I'm here for, right? But then on the other side is like, I don't care what exactly you bought in the supermarket, just tell me in one sentence. So you need both of those things in the story. And the thing that you really need to learn as a writer is when to use which and how to do both skillfully, right? So that's why in general it's not bad advice, because yes, most of the time we want to at least see the very interesting parts of the story and have that shown to us, right? But it's just half of the advice, I feel, and it's just like there's so much missing in it and so much context missing. So again, as a beginner writer, it seems to be a bit overwhelming. So that's why I will put it here. It's kind of like, again, it's giving me something to work with, but I need a whole lot more context to really make use of it. No one cares about your story. So this one, again, it's almost like you can interpret this advice in two ways. So there's one way where it's like, don't think that other people think your story idea is as interesting as you do, because they most likely won't. And don't necessarily have like a story idea that you find so brilliant that you go and tell everyone and nobody else gets it, and they basically destroy your enthusiasm for the story because you told it too soon. Learn to sit with ideas longer, keep them to yourself, give them time to flesh out into what you want them to be, so that by the time you share those ideas, they have formed into enough of your own kind of output product, what you want it to be, before other people's opinion or advice can either, ruin the fun for you or alter it so much that it isn't the original thing anymore. So on that side, I very much agree with that kind of advice, because not just in storytelling, but in all kinds of things that I've done where I had an original idea, it always worked out better when I kept the idea for myself long enough to figure out what I like about it and make it into what I want it to be, before letting other people basically start altering that thing, right? But I don't think that is the advice that is meant here when this is said, because whenever I heard this writing advice said, it's almost a bit condescending. It's kind of like this whole thing of, you are not that interesting, nobody cares about you. It's kind of like almost assuming as if all writers are just, writing stories that are basically their own life stories and self-inserting themselves as protagonists and just rambling on about themselves and making themselves into the victims and the heroes and stuff like that. And nobody wants to read that, right? Nobody wants to read your vanity project. So you are not interesting, don't even do that. And the reason why I really hate this kind of condescending sort of view is because, first of all, I don't agree that that is what we're all doing. I think a lot of us start out and actually have really cool ideas that have nothing to do with any of that, right? So there's that one side. But then the other side is kind of like, when you're first starting out writing stories, when you're first trying to come up with characters, it's really hard because you've never done it, right? You have no idea how to do it. So most likely you are starting with yourself as the character because you know yourself and you know how to write yourself. And it's basically a sort of exercise of figuring out how to take a sort of character archetype that is yourself and start molding it into a different person. So in my own experience, when I was younger, I would write much more characters that were like me in terms of the protagonist. Whereas these days, I try to write characters that are as far away from me in terms of at least their demographics or kind of like just their life experiences, because I don't basically want to relive my own life in terms of, I have my own life. I don't need to do that in fiction too. I kind of want like this escape of being someone completely else, But getting to the point where I can actually come up with different people and what they would be like was a process, and took like a long time to even just learn basically to pay attention to things that other people do that you can pick up on and start to give your characters or stuff like that. It's just kind of like a lot of skills that you don't have at the beginning. So this whole thing of that is the starting point. You are basically writing a story that nobody would want to read because it's basically just you talking about yourself all the time. Okay, but that is still a story written where you still learned a lot of stuff, and you basically, maybe you had to get it out once so that you can focus on other characters, because now you yourself have become boring in terms of you don't want to write yourself again. From a starting point as a new beginner writer, I think it's really useful, and it's kind of like the natural thing to start with yourself and your own story if you don't have any other ideas or characters as a starting point. This advice doesn't help a new writer, because it's just kind of like telling a new writer, hey, you're an idiot talking about yourself and nobody cares. Yeah, but nobody's going to read it anyway, right? So you might as well be an idiot, just talk about yourself. And hearing this kind of advice, what is the alternative? If people tell you nobody cares about your story, they're basically telling you go and write a different story that people will care about. And then you end up with basically looking to the market to see what is trending there and realize that overdone tropes are no cool thing, right? So then you're stuck again. So that's why I hate this advice. I think it's stupid advice, and I'm putting it here. So from what I know, avoid adverbs is probably a writing advice that has been around longer, but had like a new heyday after Stephen King's On Writing biography writing book came out, because he talked so strongly about how much he hates adverbs, right? So kind of like after that, it became this whole thing that got picked up in this whole writing advice repeat thing, where people would constantly say, don't use adverbs, blankly cut out all your adverbs and stuff like that, right? Then on the flip side, the Harry Potter novels are drowning in adverbs, and it didn't stop them from being a mega hit. So it also didn't stop them from getting a new franchise reboot that nobody asked for. So it doesn't seem to be that damaging, right? Again, looking at it from the perspective of a new writer who is looking for advice that will help, right? How is this advice going to help? You are just starting out, you're figuring out character, story, all these things that you have to learn, right? So now you're also supposed to go in and basically blankly cut out all your adverbs when you yourself don't even know yet if you like adverbs, or if in certain situations you like them and in others you don't, you know. It's just kind of like this kind of advice. You can judge how useful this kind of advice is later on when you know enough to basically tell if having adverbs in your style, in your genre, works for you or doesn't, and then how many and how, right? So as a beginner writer advice, very tempted to put it very far down, but I think it's not that useless, but it's also putting it with the tropes. So kind of like there's some merit to it, but there's also a lot of context and a lot of skill and a lot of other stuff missing before you would want to focus on that, in my opinion. Which brings me to the next advice that is a bit weird, and I'm interested to hear your opinion on this, because it is don't mimic other writers or famous writers' writing styles. And this one, I came across it in the form of, I think it's meant to be kind of like, don't try to be someone else, be yourself. Focus on figuring out yourself, figuring out your own style, rather than trying to copy someone. But again, coming back as a beginner writer, when you get this advice, it's basically, okay, so I don't have my own writing style figured out yet because I'm just starting. I don't know what I like. How am I supposed to figure that out if you're not allowed to go and basically try to write in the same form as the writers that you like, right? So by copying the styles of writers, you kind of start to identify the elements in the style that you like, right? So that's why personally I really think that's, from a beginner writer's perspective, that's completely useless advice, because starting to mimic other writers is one of the best ways to try out different styles yourself and, you know, basically absorb as many styles as possible so that you can then start to develop your own style. How are you going to do that if you're not allowed to have the input material to make up the elements that will become your own style, right? So that's why personally I completely disagree with this, and I think from a learner's perspective that doesn't make any sense at all. But again, if you have like a different perspective or see why this could be a problem, I would be really interested to hear it. I am putting it here. So the next advice, write what you know, is, I think it's like the most ancient writing advice that I've ever come across. And the weird thing about this advice is that I've come across it a lot of times, but every time I come across it is like when I read books from writers talking about how they started to write and the writing advice that they got. They all cite this advice as sort of like they got told you have to write what you know, and then they give their own kind of interpretation of what that is, and some agree and some strongly disagree and stuff like that, right? Personally, I've never heard this advice directly given. It was never directly given to me in terms of from writers I know. From my perspective, this is kind of like second-hand advice that I've heard of, that is such a stable thing that it's just there. I think there's a reason why it's just there, because there's some merit to it. It's like what you want to do is you want to basically take the details from your life that you can insert into the story to make it more specific in certain scenes or places, that makes it feel more alive without taking away from the story itself. Some of these details and basically reading about them is really interesting as a reader, because you are basically being inserted into a completely different life than your own, and completely different kind of like specific details of that life, right? So that's why I think this is the whole point of this advice, is really kind of like try to be as specific as you can when writing the story to make it feel as alive as possible, again without taking away from the story itself, but making the surrounding as specific, the details of the story as specific as possible. And you do that by knowing them, and that's why it's a good starting point to start with things that you know, because those you can write about, right? Again, I would actually put this at, I think, B. Write what you know is similar to write every day. It's a good starting point that you can build upon. You can then later on start to learn how to learn things so that you know them enough so that you can write about them. Research and all this stuff, right, that comes in later on. But as a starting point, when you're just trying to learn the craft itself, it's a good thing to draw from real life the details so that you don't have to worry about them too when you're still trying to just figure out how to actually write a character, right? Okay, so and then the next one for me is a completely no-brainer, very easy. Write what you like. This is the reason why I really think this is great advice, is because, again, for someone who's just starting out, you are looking for some guidance on specific starting points on how to start, and then you are looking for enough encouragement to keep at it, right? And basically, write what you like is really just that. Write a story that you yourself would want to write and then read, and if nobody else wants to read it, then at least there's one person who wants to read it. And just writing itself, it was fun, it encouraged you, and it will keep you at it, and it will make you want to learn more about the craft. So it's very rewarding, right? That's why just great advice, easy to do. Which brings me to the last advice, which I would categorize as S tier, which is to learn to finish a story. So this one is similar as write every day for me, but on a higher level. And the reason is that it's basically this whole writing every day was about, you know, I'm not good at this, I don't know what I'm doing, but I am doing a bit of it every day. I have this small accomplishment every day, and by doing that, this gives me the encouragement to stick at it, right? And learn to finish a story seems to be the same thing in terms of, it's kind of like this milestone that you need to accomplish once so that you feel the confidence that you know you can do it again, right? It's kind of like if you like running, for example, if you've run 10K once, then you know you can do it again, even though you are not as trained anymore, or you're not running that often anymore. You still know kind of like mentally, I ran this once, it's possible, I can do this again. And for me, learning to finish a story is the same thing. Once you've written your first story and had like a finish to it, you know that you can do it again, even though the first one wasn't any good. But next time you don't have to worry about whether you can even finish or not. You can start to focus more on making it better because you know you can finish it, right? So that's why, again, from a beginner writer who's just looking for actionable advice, this is really great advice. Just focus on maybe write a shorter story first, not necessarily a short story, but just a shorter story, so that you know you can finish this story, and then once you've done that, then you can start to build on that, right? So that's why I really like this advice. But this is it. Let me know what your list is, and I will see you next time. Bye guys.